Coming up, geography's effect on international affairs.
These things matter. They can't be wished away by philosophers who say don't pay attention to deterministic forces.
Atlantic correspondent Robert Kaplan discusses the geographic backdrop of the Arab Spring, American prosperity, and China's dilemma. It's just ahead on Global Ethics Forum.
Our speaker is Robert Kaplan, who is no stranger to the Carnegie Council, as he has spoken here several times before. Today, he will be discussing his latest book entitled Revenge of Geography: What the Map Tells Us About Coming Conflicts and the Battle Against Fate. This work brings together his reflections as a foreign correspondent and everything he has seen and thought about over 3 decades of reporting.
In 1755, there was an earthquake in Lisbon, Portugal, that decimated the 3/4 of the city, killed, we're not sure, tens of thousands, 100,000 people. It was like one of the greatest natural catastrophes of history. And Voltaire, the French philosopher, was 60 years old at the time, and he said, I am opposed to the earthquake. And he wrote a series of articles, over the years saying how he was opposed to this natural force imposing itself on human agency and reality. And all right, so you may think Voltaire is absurd. How can you be opposed in a policy sense to an earthquake? But actually, Voltaire had a very serious motive in mind. Because what Voltaire was really saying was, I am opposed to all great natural forces, whether it's geography, ethnic characteristics, the environment, natural resources, constraining what men and women do. And if you start to believe in those natural forces, you won't have responsibility before history. What I've just described is what motivates all the opinion pages, whether liberal, left, neoconservative, right, whether you're talking about the New York Review of Books or the Wall Street Journal editorial page. It's all about we can do something because we must do something, because we have a responsibility before history. And therefore, anyone who raises his head and talks about geography or this or that is basically the very enemy that Voltaire was trying to vanquish when he opposed the Lisbon earthquake. Now, the problem with this is that it's not true. It's very true. But philosophers don't have the responsibilities of policymakers. Policymakers wield bureaucratic power, and their first priority is to the interests of people within their geographic space who vote for them, or who don't vote for them, but who they have responsibility over anyway. So while the whole opinion elite concentrates with this half of reality, which I've just described, what I'm going to do this morning is talk about the other half of reality. Policymakers have to deal with a much sadder reality. They have to take a stand periodically against great forces, natural forces, but on a day-to-day basis, they have to pick and choose their battles. And one of the ways to pick and choose your battles is to know what's out there, to know what can be changed and what can't be changed. The reason why Taiwan still has de facto independence is because it's 100 miles from the coast of the mainland. If it were 20 miles, the width of the English Channel at the Straits of Dover, Mao Zedong would have conquered Taiwan in the early 1950s, most likely. So it's this great natural deterministic force of geography that is most important in Taiwan being the way it is. One of the reasons why Japan has been one of the largest economies in the world, and despite its economic doldrums has been such a success story overall, is because, as the great Japanese historian of Japan, Edwin Reischauer at Harvard, wrote in the mid-60s, if you take Japan and superimpose it on the east coast of the United States, northern Japan is where Maine is, Hokkaido, and Okinawa, the Ryukyu Islands, is where Key West, Florida is. In other words, Japan occupies the perfect point of the temperate zone, which is proven the most necessary for development of communities. Russia lies north of 50 degrees latitude. And given where Russia's population actually lives, it's colder than Canada on a per capita basis. China lives south of it. And China, like Japan, northern China, Manchuria is where Maine is, southern China, Yunnan province is where Florida is. It's the perfect portion of the temperate zone for development. These things matter. They can't be wished away by philosophers who say don't pay attention to deterministic forces and all. I mean, the United States. Many things may account for the success of the United States over the last 240 years or so. But the basic thing is that the United States occupied the last resource-rich part of the temperate zone that had been relatively unpopulated or underdeveloped at the time of the European Enlightenment. And the United States river system, unlike that of Russia, which divides Russia, West Siberia from East Siberia, from the Lena River, and the other rivers which run north to south. The Missouri and Mississippi and Ohio river systems run diagonally east-west, more or less, in many ways, and unite the continent. The United States, the lower 48 states, has more miles of navigable inland waterways than the rest of the world combined. And that's what really enabled Westernization. Not ideas, but this very fact that allowed for transport. And around the world I could go. Let me try to look at current events from the point of view of partially deterministic, fatalistic forces. Look at Tunisia, where the Arab Spring started. Tunisia is the closest point in the Arab world to Europe. You can take a slow car ferry from Tunis to Trapani in western Sicily, and it'll take only 7 hours. You can fly in 30 minutes. If you read Tunisian history, you find throughout the medieval and early modern age, it had as much to do with Italy and Sicily that it had to do with any other place in North Africa. If you look at a map of Roman settlements from Morocco to Egypt, you'll find age-old clusters of civilization in Morocco, Tunisia, Greater Carthage, that is, and the Nile River Valley. Algeria and Libya were basically vague geographical expressions that weren't invented as modern states until relatively recently. The road system of Tunisia was laid by the Romans. If you drive through Tunisia, chances are the road you're on was a road in Roman times because it was so close to Europe. Yet, when Scipio Africanus destroyed Carthage, destroyed Hannibal's forces, he dug a fossa regia, a demarcation ditch, which went from Tabarka in the north, south a few hundred miles, and then straight east to Sfax on the eastern Mediterranean coast. And for 2,000 years, every place within that ditch, between the ditch and the Mediterranean, was highly developed. And every place on the other side of the ditch was left to relatively low-level underdevelopment. All right, voila. You had the Arab Spring start in the part of the Arab world that was closest to Europe, but outside the demarcation ditch. In a town, Sidi Bouzid, which always had high levels of unemployment, high levels of underdevelopment. These things did not cause the Arab Spring, but they were underlying background noises and factors that help explain it better. Libya. Libya was not a place, a country, until the 20th century. Greater Tripolitania, Trablus, Tripoli in the west, was always oriented to Greater Carthage. Benghazi, Cyrenaica in the east, was always oriented towards Alexandria and the Nile Valley. It was always a nest of regionally based tribes. Therefore, when the Arab Spring spread to Libya and Egypt, It was fundamentally different in Tunisia and Egypt than it was in Libya. In Tunisia and Egypt, the issues quickly became political. A form of Islamism versus a variant of Western-style secularism, whatever. And these became pitched battles, which are still being fought. But the basic identity of the state is never an issue. There was bureaucracies. There was a motor vehicles bureau. There was agricultural forces. There were roads. There were institutional administrative development, because these places were age-old clusters of civilization because of proximity to the Mediterranean in Tunisia's case and the Nile Valley in Egypt's case. The Nile flows from south to north, but the winds go from north to south, enabling sailing in the other direction, so that Egypt became united by the Nile. Whereas in Libya, the issue was very different. The issue was governance itself, because this place wasn't really a country in the first place, partly and largely because of geographical reasons. So that the government of Libya can't really govern outside of Greater Tripoli. And the whole south has already been lost. And the ties that unite East and West are very tenuous. Syria, another vague geographical expression, more than it was, a state. Not as bad as Algeria or Libya, but also, I wrote in the Atlantic Monthly in 1992, the February issue, that Syria was not a country, that Hafez al-Assad was the Brezhnev of the Arab world, in the sense that he papered over differences of sectarian and ethnic group, but didn't create a civil society in its place. He didn't use the opportunity he had by creating stability to create a civil society. And therefore, Syria was a nest of regionally based ethnic and sectarian groups. Let's look at Russia for a moment. Everyone in the media loves to hate Vladimir Putin. They see him, that picture of him riding a horse without a shirt on, or in a leather jacket or something, and they say how unsophisticated and lower class he is. Just a thug and all of that. Vladimir Putin is just a normal Russian autocrat who looks out at the world from the point of view of Russia's geography. And what he sees and knows is that Russia encompasses half the longitudes of the earth, yet it has a population smaller than Bangladesh. And it has no natural borders in the West, which meant not only did the French and the Germans invade in the guise of Hitler and Napoleon, but so did the Swedes, the Poles, and the Lithuanians in earlier times of Russian history. So Russia requires a buffer zone in Eastern Europe. So what? The Warsaw Pact has fallen. Russia will use every means at its disposal: crime groups, intimidation, thuggery, and particularly manipulating natural gas exports and where and how Russia builds energy pipelines to reconstitute a buffer zone in the former Warsaw Pact. Russia will work with Iran to make sure that the United States does not gain a foothold in the Caucasus. We will do everything in our power to undermine a pro-Western Georgian government. This is Russian history talking, based on geography. If you had a fully democratic, human rights-oriented leader in Moscow, you would probably have similar policies. In some way or another, in the Caucasus, in Europe. Putin knows he doesn't have the military bandwidth to completely reoccupy Central Asia, but yet he will maneuver. He will maneuver troops. Putin knows that his greatest real strategic enemy is not the United States, regardless of what Mitt Romney may have implied, is China. Because Russia and China have land borders going thousands of miles. They have what is now the Russian Far East in Amuria and Asuria, greater Vladivostok, was part of China up until 1860. And China is a demographic behemoth that's growing mightily, that wants to extend its corporate and demographic reach into the Russian Far East, into former Soviet Central Asia. Russia is building roads and rail lines and pouring cash and building gas links all through former Soviet Central Asia, and it's driving the Russians crazy. And this is really what motivates Putin behind the headlines. China. China has a good geographic scenario and a negative geographic scenario. Its positive geographic scenario is that China is set to expand, as I said, in search for strategic minerals, metals, and resources like timber and hydropower into the Russian Far East, into Central Asia, especially, and to retain control of Tibet. China is at its maximum point geographically since the Hai Qing dynasty about over 200 years ago. But here's China's dilemma. The ethnic Han core of China is mainly a function of central China and coastal China. To the north, China finds ethnic Inner Mongolians. To the west, it finds Muslim Turkic Uyghurs. To the southwest, it finds Tibet. And the Dalai Lama may be a spiritual figure for Western elites, but he's really a geopolitical factor. He's a geopolitical factor because Tibet controls most of more water than maybe any other place on the earth. It controls the Brahmaputra, Meghna, and other river systems that provide water for West Bengal in India, for Bangladesh, and for much of China. And if you take away Tibet from China, you're left with a rump China that's not much bigger than China during the Ming Dynasty, without water. So this ethnic Han core looks to these high plateau and grasslands in Inner Mongolia, Xinjiang province in the west, Tibet in the southwest, where it's different ethnic groups who have had difficult historical relations with the Hans. And so the Chinese leadership says, the West wants us to liberalize. Are they crazy? We're not going to give up central control, because if we start allowing more individual freedoms, we'll have ethnic insurgencies up and running. So this is China's geographically based dilemma, etc. What is the South China Sea to China? It's China's Caribbean. What made the U.S. a great power ultimately in the late 19th century? It was domination of the greater Caribbean basin and getting European powers out. Because if you look at a map of the New World, you'll be superficial if you say the New World is divided between North America and South America. It's really divided between the whole area north of the Amazonian basin and south of the Amazonian basin. That's why Venezuela, Colombia are not in South America, regardless of what the map said. They're part of the Caribbean world. Most of the people in Venezuela all live near the coast. The south is difficult jungles. By getting control of the Caribbean, the United States was able to dominate the Western Hemisphere. And by dominating the Western Hemisphere, it was able to affect the balance of power in the Eastern Hemisphere throughout the 20th century. That's what the two world wars were about. China sees the South China Sea similarly. The South China Sea, if it can control it, gives China access to the Indian Ocean. It totally shifts the balance of power throughout the Western Pacific. The United States only has one geographic challenge. It doesn't have challenges on its east and west. That's the Atlantic and Pacific Ocean. To the north, it has another middle-class country where most of its population lives near the U.S. border. Its real geographic challenge is with Mexico to the south. Mexico has gone from 1/5 the population of the United States to 1/3 the population of the United States over the decades. Though Mexican population growth is slowing, the average Mexican is still in his mid-20s. The average American is in his mid-30s. Increasingly, the Mexican economy is in the northern third of Mexico, near the U.S. border. Most inhabitants of cities in the American Southwest are increasingly Hispanic-speaking, Spanish-speaking. And Mexico is going to affect the character and destiny of American society to as great a degree as anything that happens in the Middle East or anything that happens in China, and maybe more so in that regard. Mexico is also a country where large swaths of it are, in terms of who monopolizes the use of force, which is how you define a government in the first place, are controlled by criminal drug gangs. So the security situation in Mexico should be of prime concern to the United States precisely because of geographic reasons. Mexico, even though it is plagued by drug violence, has is number 12 in terms of the rankings of world economies, is likely to crack the top 10. Mexico is going to be a major world power over the next few decades, while southern European countries like Spain and Italy may fall through the floor and become far less important. So if you want to look at America's destiny from the point of view of geography, look less at China and the Middle East and look towards Mexico. Thank you very much.
Would you comment a bit on how you think your tour d'horizon of the powers of the world will be affected by the slow increase in the Earth's temperature?
Well, I'm not a climatologist, but I would suspect, that it would be good news for the countries in the extreme northern and the extreme southern latitudes if you had warming climates. It would probably create more difficulties for Africa, probably more opportunities for Canada if you have the opening up of Arctic sea lanes, but would probably give a country like Canada more responsibility in terms of security over time. Norway, I've noticed, is becoming a significant Arctic military power, and that will probably increase as time goes on. A warming planet also means rising sea levels. Even an infinitesimal rise in sea levels would threaten, upwards of 170 million people in Bangladesh. If you've ever been to Bangladesh, it's a ruler flat aquatic landscape where dry soil is very expensive and dear. The same could be said of much of the Nile Valley in Egypt, where many Egyptians actually live. Higher sea levels doesn't mean everybody drowns. What it really means is that the soil becomes more salty, more alkaline. Alkalinity increases, and that hurts agriculture. And that, in turn, hurts the economy of the country.
Can you comment on demographics? There are many examples of this. China's one-child policy, the concentration of young people in cities in the Arab world, and so on.
The population of northern Mexico abutting the United States has doubled since NAFTA. There's been a rush to northern Mexico, which again weakens the border between Mexico and the American Southwest. China will get old before it gets prosperous. It'll become gray before the average Chinese has a decent standard of living. India's in better demographic shape, I would think. It has a younger population than China. I think aging in the United States and in Europe is going to mean more immigration from North Africa and Mexico, or more immigration from Central America too, not just Mexico, because it's complicated. Mexico's population itself, rate of population growth is slowing too. So Mexico, in turn, may need immigration. And from where? From Central America, maybe from Africa, which still has the youngest population on the planet. Africa has the youngest population. It's the only part of the world that is yet to have a green revolution in agriculture. And it's resource rich. So it will figure quite heavily.
What does geography teach you about the future of nomadism as the city-states and the large populations have their own problems?
The person who wrote most profoundly about this was Ibn Khaldun in, I think it was the 14th century, where he said that civilization begins when nomads cluster in a certain place and build a city. And the city leads to development and to wealth. And the wealth leads to corruption and, in a more of an effete lifestyle, which leads to the city, the greater city state itself breaking up and being reformulated into other patterns. I think Ibn Khaldun was the first historian philosopher who wrote about how the relationship between civilization and nomadism. In that regard, keep in mind that over half of humanity now lives in an urban setting. We're an urbanized planet, whereas 50 years ago we weren't. And places like in eastern Turkey, which looks small on the map, have hundreds of thousands of people in them. So I think that we will continue to have, I wouldn't call them nomads so much, but as people who live outside the confines of major cities and who are able now to travel not by camel but by four-wheel drive Toyota Land Cruisers. The fact that the Toyota Land Cruiser became the preferred weapon of war in the Horn of Africa battles between the Eritreans and the Ethiopians, in the various conflicts in the African Sahel, is indicative of the effect of nomadism, in a way, on modern conflict.
Well, if you had any doubt that geography or history mattered, or that Bob Kaplan had something important to say this morning, we'll dispel that
Thank
notion.
you.
So thank you so much. It was fabulous.
For more on this program and other Carnegie Ethics Studio productions, visit carnegiecouncil.org. There you can find video highlights, transcripts, audio recordings, and other multimedia resources on global ethics. This program is made possible by the Carnegie Ethics Studio and viewers like you.